us. So anyway, thank you for joining us, and we hope this will be an interesting and relevant briefing. We have a plan. It's been a busy day for us in the with the sirens and the shelters. So if there is a warning, we will adjust the schedule. If there's a warning, Benny will be speaking with us from Haifa, Carmel from Petach Tikva area. So according to where the warning may happen, we'll switch the speakers. But right now, we are planning to start with Avi with a current update on the situation, and move to Benny, who will really give us an in-depth look at the impact on the economy, as much as he could do in 10 minutes or so. And then we'll move to Carmel, who will talk about the impact on families with young children, especially in light of the fact that all the kindergartens and all the frameworks for young children are closed up until now. All the schools are as well, but younger children make it a little harder for the parents. And we'll finish with Miri, who will give us her perspective on some kind of prediction how long this might take. I know Miri could be the best person to predict, but I'm sure she doesn't know exactly when it might end, but we'll hear from her as well. So as I said, if there's a warning, we will adjust accordingly, and we will hope to leave time for questions towards the end, but you're welcome to write any question that comes up in the chat, and we will answer it throughout the session. So I'm moving it to you, Avi.
Thank you very much, Michal. I'm going to share a presentation. This presentation is going to be joint for me and Benny. Let me just get it going. And as Michal said, I'm just really going to update you on what it is that's going on. This is the same basic information we gave a week ago, but a week ago it was one day into the war, and now we're a week into the war. And here is the title that Benny chose, which I like a lot, which is Israel at War. Again, I'm not sure it's not still, but again also works. So let's just take a quick look at what's going on inside of Israel. So this is the number of fatalities. Now, there was the first day in which there was one person who was killed in Tel Aviv. Then the next day there was a hit on a safe room inside of or a shelter inside of a synagogue, and people were still going in, and there were 9 people killed, and that was the big disaster that happened. After that, nobody was killed for almost a week. And today there were 2 soldiers who were killed in southern Lebanon. It's not exactly missiles from Iran, but still, these are 2 more people who died in this war, and those are the numbers that we have to this point. If you take a look at the number of people who have been injured, however, the numbers are completely different. And the number of hospitalized, we're getting in the hundreds, or now it's in the low 100 area of people each day. And when you take a look, or mid hundreds, or going towards 200, today was a fairly difficult day inside of Israel. And what you're seeing that most of the people who are in the hospital, who are hospitalized, who have reached the hospitals, they're only lightly injured. The injuries are not very, very significant, but there are those who are in critical condition and those who are in moderate condition. And there are also those, a small number, who it's really just anxiety related. There's no physical injury, but still it's very, very significant when that happens. And we know that what's been happening today is there's been almost non-stop bombing in the north from Hezbollah. And that's a very, very significant and very big change from what's been happening until now. When you take a look at property damages, and Benny's going to talk about this a little bit more, property damages, damage claims, you can see the numbers of claims. That's not a dollar value, but that's the number of claims that have been registered. This is much lower than you saw in the 12-day war back in June. But still, these are very significant numbers, and it adds up. And of course, it's one of the costs of the war that Benny will talk about. And when we take a look at what's happened to economic activity inside of Israel, so you can see that consumption of food, supermarkets, that hasn't really changed very much. Actually, if you had looked in the very first, what we showed last week on the first day, you actually saw a very large increase because people were stocking up because they didn't know what was going to be. So they stocked up on food stuff and drinks at home. But you see that in pretty much all over other areas, there's a significant fall in the use of credit cards, in the amount of spending that people are doing, and that's absolutely natural. People are stuck at home. They're certainly not going to hotels, but they're also far, far fewer who are going to restaurants or coffee shops, and they're also not buying a lot of clothing. What you do see is you see, of course, pharmacies. People still need their pharmaceuticals, so that continues to happen. When you take a look at the number of sirens, so you can see that there has been a very significant decrease over time. This is by day, and the numbers inside each box is the hour from 0 to 24. So the numbers only go up to 21 or 23, but it's a 0 to 24 scale. And you can see that during the first few days there were a lot more bombings, but that it's gone down. It's significant today. It was significant yesterday. It seems to be back on the rise a little bit, but not to a very, very large extent. And when you ask where the fire is coming from, you can see that there is an increasing amount or increasing percentage over time, not one for one, but still for the most part, that more of it is coming from Lebanon and less it is and a lower percentage coming from Iran. Now, when you take a look at what's going to happen today, because we don't have those numbers here, from what we hear, it sounds like there's going to be more from Lebanon today than there was in the past. But we're only going to see those numbers tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to end here for a very, very brief update and pass it over to Benny, who's going to talk to you about the economic cost of the war.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll try to really squeeze in what I think is important to know about what happens in these days and maybe what will happen next. So when we talk about economic cost of this war, or any war, then we have to separate between three elements. One is the direct cost, which is simply the ammunition and flying hours, etc. The other one is indirect cost, which comes from the fact that the economy is not functioning, or certainly functioning in a very limited way. And finally, there is the material damages that Avi has already alluded to. And I'll try to give a little bit of numbers on these various aspects of the economy, and to give you some idea. Okay, so let's start with direct and damages costs. So in principle, those are in some sense easy to measure. So we know somebody in this country knows how many interceptors have been launched, and how many bombs have been dropped, and how many hours the airplane flew, etc., etc. And all of that sums up. Now, of course, I mean, this is not openly known information, but there are some estimates that people have made. So in order to understand what is going now, it is useful to simply compare to the past events. So there are 2 nights during which the Iranians sort of shot more or less several between 100 and 200 rockets into Israel, or missiles into Israel. Then there is the Rising Lion operation, which is a 12-day war in June of 2025, and of course we have the current event. And you can see more or less what is going on, and I want to focus really on this June event in 25, because this is the one that is most closely resembling what is going on now. And there are fairly good estimates about what happened during that period, because some time has passed, and we had an ability to assess. So the estimated military cost is, again, the numbers are of course rough, something like 20 billion new Israeli shekels, which is about 1% of a yearly GDP. And then the damages were quite significant during that period. There were 2 major hits. One is the Weizmann Institute and one Soroka Hospital. And the estimates is that the damages range anywhere between 5 and 10 billion shekel. So coming to what is going on now, again, after a week or so, the estimated military cost is a little bit estimated, of course, is a little bit less than it was during Rising Lion, because the Iranian fire over Israel is much reduced, so we don't need that many intercepts. And those cost a lot, as you can see above. Each of them cost $3 million, and this is the major element of the cost. The damages, Avi has already mentioned it so far, seem to be relatively moderate. There have been, of course, damages to housing, etc., but nothing at the scale of what happened in June. So the indirect costs are, of course, much harder to assess. And basically, they come from the fact that the economy is shut down. So again, we look at the past in order to gain some idea about what is about to happen or what has already happened. And basically, we compare the episode now to, on one hand, the lockdown of the economy during the COVID crisis, and then, of course, again, the June event. And once you compare all of those, and I won't go into the numbers, you can see what is going on in the next slide, where it is depicted simply. So these two curves, these two pairs of curves, depict on one hand what happens to GDP per capita. This is the upper pair, and the lower pair is consumption per capita, where the red line is sort of a trend line, so where the economy should have been had there been no crisis, and the blue line is the actual result. And what you see is that COVID, of course, created a huge sort of dip in GDP per capita, but the economy has recovered quite nicely. And then comes October 7th, and again there is a major dip. And there is a dip, but not that big, due to the June event of last year. But again, notice that the economy is recovering, and this is something that one needs to take into account when one looks at the next pictures. So, first of all, this is again confirming that what is going on now is, roughly speaking, similar to what we had during Rise and Lion, and therefore it is really crucial to enable routine life to resume, in order not to create even more damages to the economy. Of course, all of that is security dependent and depends very much on the achievement of the Air Force over Iran. And let's look a little bit, really briefly, at the consequences for the world. Okay, so here is what happens to crude oil prices, and of course this is dramatic, right? Remember, the war started on February 28th, so you immediately see a really significant increase of crude oil prices. There is a little bit of a dip at the end, but these prices are much higher than they used to be. And this, of course, is going to affect the economies all over the world, including the United States. And if we move on, we see how the stock markets have reacted. In particular, you see here both major stock markets in the United States, the Nasdaq and the Dow Jones. I'm sorry, the Standard & Poor's and the Dow Jones. Both of them, the lower curves, are sort of dipping with the onset of the war and the increase of oil prices. But lo and behold, what happens to the Israeli stock market? It is thriving. And I come back to what I've said just a moment ago, that Israel's economy tends to emerge very quickly out of crises. And obviously, the Israeli economy is believing in itself and looking forward is very optimistic. And if you look at the last slide, then you can see what happened over the last year. So it's really amazing, right? I mean, we are talking about a year during which there were all kinds of events, right? We have already mentioned several of them. And nevertheless, the Israeli stock exchange is constantly rising in value. in particular, of course, relative to the both United States stock markets, once again, reiterating the point that the Israeli sort of outlook, at least according to what this picture is predicting, seems to be very good. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Benny. We're going to move on to Carmel, Dr. Carmel Blank, who is also sharing her presentation, right?
Okay. Do you see the presentation okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about families during wartime with data that some are from 5 years ago, because we have, as Avi mentioned, not just one war during the past few years. And then I'm going to talk about what this condition is doing to young children and their parents, their families. So first, when we look at the literature, we know that ongoing conflicts are not doing good either for parents or for young children. Some may think that young children, maybe 2 or 3 years old, they don't understand what sirens are. They don't understand what it means to have a war. They don't understand what they hear on the news, but they understand a lot. And they mainly understand when their parents are stressed. And during conflict, not only in Israel, there were studies on 9/11 at United States, studies on many conflict zones around the world. It takes its toll from parents, mainly from parents to young children that needs to take care of them during stressful times. And this causes to negative parenting. We are more stressed, we don't have energy or patience to deal with our children. We saw this also in the current war in a survey made by the Early Education Initiative in Taub Center. So the effects are not good either for parents or for children. We know that young children, up until the age of 6 or 7 or 8, it depends on which country, they are extremely vulnerable. They are very sensitive to their environment. Their brain is developing, so they absorb everything that happens. And when they absorb a lot of stress, it can harm their development. It can harm their cognitive, emotional, social development. And also it comes out in trauma, fears, sleep problems, the bedwetting of older children that are not bedwetting anymore. And when we're talking about war in Israel, it usually comes with closure of educational frameworks, which are extremely important in Israel because we have very high rate of very young children engaged in these frameworks. More than half of toddlers up until the age of 3, where education is not free and is not compulsory, more than half of them are going to educational frameworks, and they stay there for between 30 to 50 hours a week, which is very high comparing to other OECD countries where they have longer maternity leaves or they have flexible daycares where you can put your child to a few hours a day or few days a week. In Israel, the children are going to their frameworks 5 or 6 days a week, usually 8 hours a day other than Friday. So they spend a long hours in the educational frameworks, and the daily routine of us, of the parents, totally depends on the educational frameworks being open. And once they are closed, it disrupts the routine of the families. And this disruption has also a negative effect from studies done on the corona, where there was closure of educational frameworks. It did stress the children. Children need a routine, and they can handle interrupted routine much less than their parents. So the finding that I'm going to present comes from the Guardian of the Wall operation, which held in 2021. It was a 10 days military operation against the Hamas in Gaza. And back then also missiles were launched at civilian population, mainly at the south and in the center of Israel. We had convenience sampling of whoever parents that answered the survey, almost 500 parents for young children from birth to the age of 6. And this was a very interesting situation because unlike the current war where educational frameworks are totally closed all over the countries, back then there were, it depends on the local authority and it depends on how far you were from Gaza. So some areas have educational frameworks open, and some areas which sometimes very close to the areas where the educational frameworks were closed, then the educational frameworks were open. For example, I live in kibbutz Nir Petach Tikva. We have 5 kilometers from here another kibbutz. Our frameworks were closed and their frameworks were open. So it's somewhat of a natural experiment where we have families that are living very close by. They have the same amount of alarms. I took only families that had few alarms, which means between 3 to 5 alarms all through the week that the measurement took place. And I compared between these families, looking at the level of parental distress, parent-child interactions, children's difficulties, because when you think about it, maybe when there's a security threat and alarms are going by, maybe I want my children close. Maybe it's scary to have my children in educational frameworks, 15, 30, sometimes even 35 children with 2 or 3 caregivers. It can be frightening for parents. So I wanted to see when our parents are more relaxed and when children are better off at the house or away at the educational frameworks. Now you can think and may guess where they're better off. I'll show you at the next slide. I just want to say that I controlled for a social economic background of the family and number of children, whether the parents were working from home or not, worked part-time or half-time or full-time. So what I'm going to show you is controlling for a lot of environmental context of the families. So the key findings, which were surprising to me, because usually when we talk about social sciences, we don't see a lot of strong correlations. The situations is sometimes very complex, and we see one trend, and we see when we look at other behaviors, we see different trends. But here it was very, very clear. When educational frameworks are open and we have the routine, the parents are happy and the children are calm and happy too. When the frameworks are closed, the parents are very stressed and the children are less happy. When the frameworks are closed for very young children, we see higher parental distress, much higher and statistically significant higher distress. There is much more negative parent-child interactions. I asked the parents, how often do they yell at the child or punish them? And they answer they do it much more. Now beware that when children are at the educational frameworks, usually they spend with the parents 30 to 40 minutes at the morning, and then they can come home at 4 o'clock and they're going to bed. These are young children at 7 o'clock. So we have children that spend with their families about 3 to 4 hours a day, other than sleeping time, and children that stay home for the entire day. So maybe we can think, okay, when the child is at home so many hours, there are much more interaction with the parents, so there are more negative interactions. But what was surprising for me is I also measured positive interactions. Maybe there is some compensation effect. Maybe I'm shouting at my kids, but I'm also reading them much more stories or talking with them about their emotions. But I saw that the positive interactions had no significant difference between whether the educational frameworks were open or closed. So even though the children spend almost 3 times more hours a day with the parents, there were no more positive interactions. There were only more negative interactions. And this also affected the children that showed more difficulties. I asked whether they are crying, clinging to their parents. They had more fears, more tantrums. And you usually think that maybe when there's some kind of threat, children will have very hard time being away from home. But it seems that the educational frameworks provide a routine, sometimes more calm environment for children than being at the house with the parents that also had to work. Back then, the market was open and parents were working from home.
Carmel, you have 2 more minutes.
Okay. So I just want to mention that the positive effect of opening educational frameworks was also when I measured areas with much more alarms and not only a few times a week. Nowadays, just 2 short data, we see that parents are reporting increased stress of their children. This is a survey done at 2024 on the October 7th war. So we see that children are much more stressed, and also parents are more stressed. At 2024, 1 of every 5 parents had very high levels of stress, and 1 out of 4 parents had higher level of anxiety. And this was 2 years ago. So the current war is happening when we are already stressed, burned out. We don't have much more to give to ourselves and for our children. So the policy recommendations or the implications of that findings is first, as Benny said, that the educational frameworks and the routine of the children and their families are very important. They are essential during wartime. Also, it's important to keep facilities open and safe. We found out in a different survey that almost 20% of the educational care frameworks to children under 3 doesn't have any closed shelter. So of course they can't be open when there are alarms. So the recommendations is first to invest in safe infrastructures and shelters for educational frameworks so they can be open, train the staff to handle crisis and management trauma-informed care, and also to provide clear closure or opening protocols for the educational frameworks. Right now, every day, we're trying to guess what will happen within 2 days. It's also important, of course, to support families. But the main message is that educational frameworks are important. They are not only education, but also they're crucial for the public health and for family resilience. So when we are talking about children's safety and well-being, we should think not only about their physical safety when there are alarms, but also their emotional and their parents' emotional safety, and take that into account when we decide how long should we keep the educational framework closed and where. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kobed. Well said, well reported. We're going to move to Miri for the last part, and then we'll open it up for some questions, hopefully.
I'm going to try and be succinct and short. And as you can see, I'm one of the wandering Jews who's not at my house because I don't have a mamad, so I come and stay with my sister at nighttime. And I want to focus on 3 points. One is Hezbollah in the north, because this is going to have implications that are going to impact us a lot. It was mentioned before, but I want to highlight that. I want to talk about the economic impact that this is having, not just on the world, but specifically on the Middle East, because this is something that may be what I can say that will bring me to what interests all of us is how long is this going to go on? So this is a joint operation, US, Israel against the Islamic regime of Iran. But as of 4 days, it is also an Israeli operation against Hezbollah, one of the proxies in Lebanon. And I want to say that clearly that militarily, yes, it's one, but that it actually does have different implications. Because we border Lebanon, because Hezbollah is on the other side of the border, because that's something that was like the continuation of what Israel did before, one of the main decisions that was made up north is that they would not evacuate the Israeli communities that were evacuated and only came back home in March of 2025. Rather, what the Israeli military is doing is building, and I'm very challenged by the term, do we call it a buffer? We're trying to move away the threats of Hezbollah that directly threaten the northern Israeli communities. All of the northern Israeli communities, and I could show you afterwards because Hezbollah is very psychological warfare, and they've done things that they did in 2023 and 2024. They put out maps where they say in Hebrew, where it says leave. It's supposed to be the parallel to the maps that Israel puts out with the Arab IDF spokesperson who tells both in southern Lebanon and in other places that they're supposed to leave. They're putting out similar maps to the north of Israel. They put out a specific one for Kiryat Shmona and Nahariya, the 2 big cities, but they put out a whole map which shows the entire northern aspect. And I say that because that is something that's not going to be over soon, meaning the Israeli decision to try to go into southern Lebanon is a physical one, it's a ground force one, and it's to try to move all of the different Hezbollah units, mainly that have anti-tank missiles, ATMs, that were the ones that were directly hitting the Israeli northern communities, to move them out of the distance, which means you have to go in 8 to 10 kilometers so that they cannot fire at 8 to 10 kilometers. That's element number 1 to be aware of, because it's not joint, it's not with the US. This is very Israeli against the Islamic regime's proxy, Hezbollah, but it's also close to home. Second point is that the Gulf countries, which when we spoke last Sunday, it was happening, but let me tell you, since then in the last week, what Iran has done, what the Islamic regime is doing very clearly is targeting both what they're going to call military targets, even though from day one they were attacking not only military targets, and then very openly what they have been doing is attacking the economic strength, mainly of, I'm going to call the main 3, but it's really of all of them, of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, of Qatar, and of United Arab Emirates. They haven't attacked Qatar as much as the other ones, but what's happened is that over the last few days, both Qatar has been closing its gas installations. As they say, they can't export it anyways. It's dangerous, so they're closing it off. They're closing off in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia some of the oil installations. This has a ripple effect worldwide. And what the Islamic regime is trying to achieve is to make Qatar and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and then I say UAE. UAE doesn't have oil and gas. UAE is the tourism mecca. It's not about the expats. It's actually about the fact that it was for itself a place where people went to live the secure, quiet life. And the Islamic regime is trying to show everybody, no, it's not. And it's the combination of those 3 countries mainly. I mean, UAE as one, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, but don't underestimate, I mean, Bahrain and Kuwait, because everybody's been attacked. But the idea is to put pressure on the United States to stop. And just think of what Ben was saying before about the impact already on oil prices and on stock markets. And so the last point that I'm going to talk about is, so when does this end? Militarily, there's a lot to do. Militarily, There's a lot to do against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and there's a lot to do against the Islamic regime in Iran. When I say a lot, certainly another week, another 2 weeks to go after the different targets of the regime that, that 93 million people, 47 years of regime, lots of different sites, and they're doing both the regime sites and all of the different military type sites that are there. But then I go back and I say, is it about Israel? Israel is very intent right now when it comes to Hezbollah in Lebanon, because that's nearby. And I think that you saw from Avi's graphs about the sirens that we're at the stage where statistics for Israel is not the, how can I put it? It's a scary time. I thought I would sleep in my house tonight. And I want you to understand, I'm somebody who understands what the missiles are, what the statistics are, how you do that. And then today it hit in the afternoon, and that was debris somewhere, Tel Aviv, somewhere in Petah Tikva. People were injured. And I thought to myself, statistics are against us right now. The Iranians still have the capability to fire these missiles, and statistically, you never intercept them all. So there's the combo of Israel wants to continue to go against the different targets, both in the Islamic regime of Iran and against Hezbollah. The United States is gung-ho right now, but I think that the answer to when this ends is the combo of the Gulf countries and the United States more than anything else. I will never predict what President Trump will do. There is an aspect that there's midterms in the United States. It's not just about elections here. There's midterms in the United States. I mean, that if the economy spirals out of control in the United States because of what's happening there, that is going to impact the continuation of that. And the last point, especially for our wonderful people who are on board on this call, who are from the United States in that sense. The way that this war, because by the way, to me, what's happening now is the direct continuation from October 7th, 2023. It's just a question of the high intensity. It's the exact same war. And I could give you a whole different lecture on that one. It's not a different war. It's just the high intensity against Iran, high intensity. It changes in its different areas, but it started on October 7th. And I say that because what's being presented now in the United States specifically is absolutely something you need to realize, that in the United States, you're participating in this war. The 2 soldiers that were killed, sadly, late last night against Hezbollah in Lebanon by Hezbollah, that's part of our local aspect, okay? But 6 U.S. servicemen being killed in Kuwait by Iran in a war, that impacts you. And the voices that are vehemently against the war, there's a legal aspect. There are all sorts of different aspects, but you need to realize the gap is not a gap that exists here. All of the Israeli opposition leaders, all of them, have all said, we absolutely support the aims of the war, the destruction of, as much as possible, the Islamic regime and its capabilities. And we're totally against everything that this government is doing in the judicial, and we're against what's happening in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, all sorts of things. But when it comes to what Israel is doing against the Islamic regime, there's enormous support. And you need to realize that that's one big gap that you need to be aware of just in your day-to-day life. I'll end with that right here. That was more than enough.
Thank you, Miri. So speaking of statistics, Nir just pointed out to me that we broke them in terms of not having a siren, neither the last time we were together or today. So we have time for some questions and answers.